So when you're discussing why it is that black people are poorer on average than white people are, one thing that people often talk about is educational opportunity. They'll say that black Americans have less educational opportunity than do white Americans, and that this is an important part of the explanation for why it is that black Americans are on average poorer. Now, certainly it is true that African Americans relative to white Americans are less likely to, say, graduate from college. They have lower levels of educational attainment, and they also have worse grades. In fact, the difference in GPA between black and white Americans is larger than is the difference between poor and non-poor people. And we see the same thing if we look at SAT scores, where black Americans from households of over $100,000 in yearly income score below white students with incomes between $20,000 and $25,000. So some people look at this data and they say that, well, clearly what must be going on is that black Americans must be going to lower quality schools, and this must explain the difference in scholastic performance, which in turn translates into a difference in income when people are older. Now, specifically, the variable that's talked about the most here is per pupil spending. And before even looking at racial differences in school funding, it is worth asking the question, does school funding even matter for student performance? And the answer to that is yes, but only so much. So there was a 2015 paper that analyzed the impact on test scores of 68 different legislative changes to school spending that took place at the state level between 1990 and 2013. And it is important to look at data that is based on legislation changes as opposed to other changes in school funding, because school funding is significantly tied to local property taxes, and property taxes are tied to property values, and because of this, when areas become poorer, school funding will decrease. When places become richer, school funding will increase. But then you might see changes in test scores which are due to regional changes in poverty levels, not due to changes in school funding. So they looked at these changes in school funding due to legislation, and what they found was that a $500 increase in spending led to roughly a 0.09 standard deviation increase in test scores. Now, if you do decide to look at a recession, what you want to do is control for those regional changes in poverty. And that's what this 2018 paper did. It looked at changes in school funding around the time of the Great Recession, but it controlled for regional changes in poverty, and it estimates that a 10% reduction in spending leads to roughly a 0.08 standard deviation reduction in test scores, as well as a 2.6% decrease in graduation rate. And we see a similar thing in this 2018 paper looking at various changes across 24 states, where they estimate that a 10% increase in spending leads to a 0.05 to 0.09 standard deviation increase in test scores, and a 2.1 to 4.4% increase in people finishing high school. So what we can see is multiple papers looking at multiple data sets coming to pretty similar conclusions in terms of spending having a moderate effect on student performance and the probability of finishing school. This 2015 paper looked at the relationship between changes in spending and various life outcomes. So it found that a 10% increase in per pupil spending for all 12 years of public school, so that's a 10% increase 12 times, leads to 0.27 more completed years of education, 7.25% higher wages, and a 3.67% reduction in someone's probability of being poor. So we get moderate but real effects. And turning to race, to establish that black students have less funding than white students do, liberals will often cite research that have a peculiar characteristic, and that is that they're always district level analyses. And it's true, you can find lots of papers, lots of articles about the fact that the wider a school district is, the more money tends to be sent to it. But we might ask, why are all of these analyses at the district level? And that's always a good question to ask if you see a statistical analysis, and it is done in a way that doesn't seem like the most obvious way to do it, then you need an explanation for why it is being done in that weird way. And in this case, it is very important that it is being done that way, because research also shows that there's a bias in funding within districts. So a 2017 paper looked at school level as opposed to district level data, and what it found was that within any given school district, the less wide a school is, the more of the district's funding that school tends to get. And so we have competing biases here. We have the fact that across districts, wider districts get more money, but within districts, wider schools get less money. So obviously, in order to figure out whether or not black students are actually getting less well funded, we have to look at per pupil spending at that actual individual level, not at the level of school district. And as it turns out, there are plenty of papers that do this. There's a 2008 paper, and it looked at per pupil spending for U.S. schools between 1972 and 2002, and it found, I'm just going to quote their result here, they say in 1972, the ratio of non-white to white spending was 0.98 or 98%. This trend had reversed by 1982 as spending per pupil for non-white students was slightly higher than for white students in most states and in the United States as a whole, and has been for the last 20 years. And so this 2008 paper is saying that since 1982, spending for non-white students has been higher than spending for white students. So a little more recently, this 2011 paper finds that there are indeed biases such that black students have slightly more funding than white students do. But after you adjust for the local cost of living, this difference is reduced to only 1%, and there is a slight bias such that Hispanic students on average receive 96% of the funding of white students, and Asian students receive 97% of the funding. So these aren't massive differences either way, and if we're particularly talking about African Americans, they in fact receive slightly more funding, and even with respect to Hispanic Americans, small differences in funding are not going to get you a large effect in life outcome, considering that the effects of life outcome themselves are not that large to begin with. Now, the left's response to these sorts of analyses by their scholars has been truly bizarre. So there was a 2011 report from the Center for American Progress, and they looked at 3 years worth of data, and they broke it down by state. And they say, quote, racial disparities in education spending clearly exist in a host of other states. In Illinois, New York, and Pennsylvania, per pupil expenditure for Black and Hispanic students hover around 90% of those for white students. And this is true, but it's as if these academics don't know what an average is. So if people look at national data, of course, within states, they will vary around that average, and the paper makes a big deal out of states that underfund minority students, but does not make an equally big deal out of states that overfund them. I mean, there are states in this data set in which Black students receive 18% more funding than white children, but when white children receive 10% more funding than Black students, well, suddenly that's a problem, right? And so it's hard to not interpret this kind of discourse in a way that suggests that these academics are coming at this from a frankly anti-white bias. And so even if on the average it looks pretty much like equality, we need to look within that average and get rid of all of the examples in which Blacks are underfunded and not care about those in which they are overfunded. Now, the result of that, of course, if that were done, would be to produce an average that is very significantly in favor of Black students. So with per pupil spending on the whole, I don't think it makes much of a big difference in terms of racial differences. It's hard to see how it could, given the average level of per pupil spending by race. Liberal academics respond to this in ways that are pretty ridiculous. And so let's move on to class size, because class size is a specific variable that gets a lot of attention in the education research. And so turning to this 1979 meta-analysis on the relationship between class size and student performance, we see the relationship exhibits a very important feature, which is that there isn't much of a difference in student performance if you're looking at students that are in classes with 30 students on the one hand and 40 students on the other. But if you're looking at students who attend classes with 17 students on the one hand and 7 on the other, well, then there is a significant difference. And that's important when interpreting research that tries to get at a causal inference. And of course, this research cannot get at a causal inference because a lot of this is just observational, and there may be differences in the sorts of students who tend to go to small and large classes. You can get around this by looking at studies that either try to control for student quality before they enter these classes, or by looking at proper randomized assignment to classes. There is a 1989 meta-analysis of such studies, and the median effect size in this data set is 0.13. So going to a, quote, small class as opposed to a, quote, large class leads to a 0.13 standard deviation increase in test scores. Again, not an overwhelming effect, but definitely a worthwhile effect. And you see similar things in this 1999 paper on Tennessee's Project STAR, a very famous project, and it's estimated that class size had an effect of about 0.22 standard deviations, and in this case they're comparing people in fairly large classes to people who at most have 17 students per class. And importantly, an analysis finds that these increases in test scores are still evident in a 5-year follow-up. We see a similar thing with Wisconsin's SAGE program, a 5-year project that reduced class sizes in Wisconsin to 15 students per teacher. Like the Tennessee program, this Wisconsin program is estimated to have increased scores by about 0.2 standard deviations. There's somewhat of an exception to this dealing with California. In 1996, California reduced its class sizes from an average of 29 to a maximum of 20, and this reduction only increased scores by 0.05 to 0.1 standard deviations, but this smaller effect is to be expected given the nonlinear relationship between class size and student performance that I mentioned before. And in any case, for whatever reason, California rolled this program out like crap. They did not properly test the students prior to its implementation, and so this data is very questionable anyway. But if we turn to race, we see a similar thing we saw with per pupil spending. So in 1972, white students on average had classes with 19.32 students, whereas non-white students had classes with 19.58 students. This is not a difference large enough to do anything really to their test scores at all. And in 1992, there was actually a half student bias in favor of non-white students. Non-whites had class sizes basically of 12.5 compared to 13 for whites. And so there's, again, not a bias here, or if there is a bias, it is actually in favor of non-white students. Interestingly, if we look at this analysis of the segregated South, we see that by the late 1940s, the differences in class size in the segregated South were probably not large enough to really matter. If these are differences of 15% or so, we're talking classes of 20 or more, so we're talking about the difference maybe between being in a class of 22 people versus 20 people, and the research suggests that that sort of difference is not going to matter very much at all. Not that it'll be zero, the effect, but it'll be very close to zero. So even back then, even in the worst parts of the country in terms of this sort of bias, the effect would not have been very large. This isn't to say that it was never significant. So if we look here at the same graph, 1915, these are very large differences in class size that probably could have mattered, but that was quite a long time ago. Now, if we turn to teacher quality, there's a lot of controversy about how much teacher characteristics matter and which characteristics matter. I'm not going to attempt to review all of that literature in this video. video, so let's just assume that they do matter. Or if they don't matter, then racial differences in teacher quality and these characteristics, also don't matter. And so if the liberal position is at all tenable, then we're going to have to assume that they matter. So we'll assume they matter. But again, what we find if we look at the data is that by the early 1990s, black students on average were being taught by teachers who had higher levels of education and more experience. They were also getting taught by teachers who were getting paid more. And again, returning to that analysis of educational differences in the segregated South, what we see is that by the 1950s in the segregated South, there was basically no difference between black and white teachers. And so you look at these teacher characteristics, and the only conclusion you can come to really is that if they matter, then they are helping non-white students, not hurting them. Another school variable that is brought up sometimes in these conversations is class offerings. So we can talk about what is sometimes called the full range of math and science courses. That's Algebra 1 and 2, Geometry, Calculus, Biology, Chemistry, and Physics. The majority of schools offer this set of courses, but 71% of white Americans attend a school with these full set of courses, compared to 70% of Asian Americans, 67% of Hispanic Americans, and only 57% of African Americans. Now, obviously, the thing that jumps out there is the African American number. That's the difference which might matter if curriculum matters for life outcomes. So does curriculum matter for life outcomes? As far as I can tell, the research just isn't there to say. So there are empirical estimates that say things like in high school, taking a bunch of advanced classes as opposed to basic classes predicts a 7% increase in income in adulthood. But obviously, we have to worry about the fact that the people who have credit for advanced courses in their transcripts are people who were able to take and pass such advanced courses. These people are going to be smarter and more self-disciplined than average, and it could be that those traits are what is causing the correlation between them taking those courses and their income. And I've been unable to find any studies which control for these sorts of psychological variables and then look at what the relationship is between curriculum and life outcomes. In any case, though, when we're talking about the class offering differences between black and white Americans, we can really only talk about an unfair difference in educational opportunity if it is true that there are a significant number of African Americans who would have succeeded in advanced classes but are not succeeding in those classes because they're not offered in their schools. Now, before I noted there was a 14-point gap between blacks and whites in the probability that they will attend a high school which offers the full possible set of STEM courses. But this does not mean that there's a 14-point gap among black Americans if we're only looking at black and white Americans who are actually able to succeed in such classes. Now, we can shed some light on this question by looking at data on AP classes. There does not seem to be much of a racial difference in the AP classes offered in schools. We can see here national data looking in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There was somewhat of a negative relationship for black Americans in the 70s, but not much of one by the 80s, and I don't see how you could really make much of a case for the 1990s. I haven't been able to find more recent national data, but there are state-level data that supports this conclusion. So data from Florida shows that black and Hispanic students are roughly as likely as white students to attend a high school offering AP courses in math, science, English, and the social studies. And the same is true evidently of Texas. In California, there do seem to be minuscule black-white differences in AP course offerings, but they're not very large. There are, however, substantial differences in California for Hispanic. So it's a slightly mixed picture, but overall, the majority of the data suggests that there isn't much of a difference here by race. But there is a big difference in terms of the proportion of people who pass AP classes. So black people account for roughly 9% of those who take AP classes, but only 4% of those who pass the relevant AP exams. And in fact, among black students who take an AP test, these are people who, for whatever reason, think they can pass it, only 26% receive a qualifying score. Now, to pass an AP test, you need to score 3 or higher, and for whites who take the test, the mean score is 2.97, and this is a really good mean score in the sense that it implies that the right number of white people are taking AP courses, because if you restricted the current set of white people who are taking AP courses to an even more qualified subset, well, then the average would raise above 3, and so you would have people who could have scored, say, 3.01 not taking the test. You would have people who should be taking the test because they could pass it not taking the test, and that would be bad. But the black mean score is only 1.91, and this suggests that the set of black students who are capable of passing the test is probably a great deal smaller than the set of black students currently attempting them. And so if you look at GPA data, or if you look at this AP data, it seems almost surely true that if every person who is able to complete all the STEM classes a high school can offer attend a high school which does offer said STEM classes, then black people will be less likely than white people to attend a high school that offers these classes, because a smaller proportion of black people are actually able to pass them. Now, I can't say exactly how large this gap due to ability will be, but it looks like it will be pretty large. I mean, consider the AP Calculus AB exam. This is roughly Calculus 1 in college, and on average, white students pass this class while only 28% of black students do. And so given this, it would seem only appropriate that white students are more likely than black students to attend a high school that offers calculus. And so I'm inclined to think that this difference in ability to pass courses is the primary cause of racial differences in class offerings in high school. I mean, I really don't know what even the competing theory is supposed to be, that black schools have tons of students who are able to pass classes like calculus, but the schools simply refuse to offer such courses because the students students are black. That seems kind of cartoonish to me and not very plausible. And again, it isn't as if black schools lack teachers that have the education to teach these classes. Black schools, once again, have teachers that are more educated than white schools. And so look, we don't have good data suggesting that class offerings even affect life outcomes. There are racial differences in class offerings, but we also don't have any good data suggesting that those differences are unfair. And so I don't think that this is an area that substantiates the leftist viewpoint on educational opportunity by race. And if for the sake of argument we were to say that the association between class offerings and income is entirely causal, and let's say half the class offering gap is unfair, well then that would lead to a 0.49% wage gap between blacks and whites. That's relatively small compared to the entire gap that actually exists. And obviously the assumption that the association between class offerings and income is entirely causal and has nothing to do with the sort of people who tend to take advanced classes is not realistic. Now, one plausible determinant of educational opportunity is just the quality of your peers. And here I do think there's a significant racial difference, and this is because blacks on average are lower quality students than are white students, and so people that go to schools with lots of black students will tend to do worse because of the fact that, well, it has lots of black students. And of course, this isn't to say that all black students are bad students or anything like that. Really bad students are a minority in all groups. I'm just suggesting that bad students are slightly more common among black Americans than among white Americans. And I don't really know how you could possibly even think this isn't true. If you look at, again, just GPA scores, right? Like, they do less well in school. They do less well on SATs, standardized tests, grades. If you look at data on study habits, they spend less time doing homework than white students do. And they also engage in a lot more hooliganism, you could say. So for instance, the proportion of a school that is black or non-white significantly correlates with its frequency of very serious violent incidences, such that schools that are more than 50% minority have a rate of such incidents that is 5 times that of schools that are less than 5% minority. Now, these behavioral differences are reflected in differences in punishment rates. So there's this LA Times article reporting on the Civil Rights Data Collection, which is a national survey done by the U.S. Department of Education, and it finds that even in preschool, black preschool students were 3.6 times more likely than white preschool students to be suspended. And these differences in suspension and expulsion rates persist as kids grow older, of course, and they remain after controlling for socioeconomic status. Now, it is not hard, I should say, to make these differences statistically go away. So, for instance, if you control for a kid's past history of behavioral problems, if you look at black and white students that are, say, age 12, and they have the same history of behavioral problems before today, going forward, they're going to have the same rates of suspension and expulsion. You can also look at people who have been sent to the principal's office, and this may seem dumb, but there's a reason for looking at this. You look at a black and white student who have both been sent to the principal's office for the same thing. Are they equally likely to be suspended or expelled? The answer to that is yes. And the reason why I bring this up is because there's some liberals who engage in a kind of denialism about the behavioral differences between black and white students. And they say, oh, sure, they're expelled more and they're suspended more, but that's just because of bias. These sorts of findings are not consistent with that, nor is the findings concerning the incidence of very serious violent incidents. Now, given this data, it should not be surprising that there are racial differences in bullying behavior. So we can look at this 2006 paper and a little terminology to explain. Out-degree bullying is bullying other people, and in-degree bullying is kind of a measure of victimization. It's the number of other students who have picked on the student that we're looking at. Now, the research shows that black students are more likely than white students to be bullies, white students are more likely than black students to be the victims of bullying, and Latino students are more likely to be both bullies and the victims of bullying. In these sorts of analyses, they control for things like family socioeconomic status, neighborhood socioeconomic status, self-reported attachment to friends and parents in school, the level of physical development, all these sorts of things, and these do not make racial differences in bullying behavior go away. And unsurprisingly, with respect to interracial bullying, specifically black on white bullying is about 64% more common than white on black bullying. And in part, these differences are caused by differences in student subculture, which I think speak more broadly to student quality. Because after controlling for gender, age, academic performance, family structure, parental educational attainment, and extracurricular activities, it has been shown that non-white students who bully other people are more popular than are their peers who don't bully people as much. So the more you bully if you're a non-white student in an American school, the more popular you tend to be. But this is not true for white students. White students are not socially rewarded for bullying behavior by their peers, while non-white students are. And so look, if we're talking about in-class behavior, which is reflected in the expulsion and suspension rates, if we're talking about bullying behavior, if we're talking about scholastic achievement, if we're talking about study habits, black students and to a lesser degree Hispanic students come out on average being lower lower quality students. And so, given this, it should not be surprising that the proportion of a school which is minority negatively predicts various student outcomes. And again, what would the alternative be to just say that, student quality and peer quality has no effect? Now, I could see certain very far-right people saying that, but a liberal saying that I think would be very strange. And so, firstly, let's just talk about outcomes that are actually directly related to bullying. So, one research report finds that, quote, regardless of race, attending a high minority school increases the risk of suicide significantly. For every 1 percentage point increase in the percent minority of a school, the likelihood of suicide also increases by 1%. So that seems significant. There's also this 2000 study finding basically what you would expect. White students who attend a predominantly non-white school are at an elevated risk for being victimized by other students. But the same is even true of black students. To a lesser degree, black students that attend majority black schools are more likely to be victimized by bullying behavior. And again, controlling for poverty did not significantly change these results. With respect to scholastic performance, we see from this 2015 paper that scores in standardized tests negatively correlate with the proportion of a school which is black. So students who go to blacker schools tend to do less well. This is true of black students and of white students. If you control for socioeconomic status, going to a blacker school continues to predict negative performance among black students, but in this analysis it did not continue to predict negative performance among white students. This 1999 paper looked at data of roughly 18,000 students, and it found some interesting results. So in the first place, it found that test scores were lower in whiter schools, but they were higher for students who were in classes that had more white kids. So the ideal here, according to this model, would be to go to a school which is high in diversity, but then go to a class which is consisting almost entirely of white people. And it should be noted that the effect of diversity at the class level is stronger than the effect of diversity at the school level, so that if you had to choose one or the other, you would choose to go to a wider school with wider classes based on this model. These differences continue to be true after researchers controlled for family income, parental education, race, sex, region of the country people live in, class size, school size, teacher degree of experience and formal education, etc. It's not clear why this differential finding emerged. It may be, however, that school level diversity increases test performance exactly because at the school level, more minorities leads to more experienced, higher qualified teachers and more funding. School diversity also negatively predicts how much students say they enjoy school. So consider this 2003 paper, which looked at results from 140 American universities, and they found, quote, as the proportion of black students rose, student satisfaction with their university experience dropped, as did their assessments of the quality of their education and the work ethic of their peers. In addition, the higher the enrollment diversity, the more likely students were to say that they personally experienced discrimination. Faculty members also rated students as less hardworking as diversity increased. Enrollment diversity was positively related to students' experience of unfair treatment, even after the effects of all other variables were controlled. As the proportion of black students grew, the incidence of these personal grievances increased among whites. Among black students, however, there was no significant correlation. Thus, diversity appears to increase complaints of unfair treatment among white students without reducing them among black students. Now, notably, these perceptions were not shared by faculty and administrators, so the study writes, among faculty and administrators, higher minority enrollment was significantly associated with perceptions of less campus discrimination. So the faculty think that discrimination is going down among the students as diversity increases, but if you ask the students, it's actually going up, and in particular, seemingly black on white discrimination is going up. Now, it's also worth saying that increases in the proportion of a school that was Asian actually increased student satisfaction of school, and all of these results remain true after controlling for various measures of socioeconomic status and the like. So yeah, it might seem a little rude to say, but the data just sort of says it for itself. Student quality seems to be a measure on which black schools are genuinely worse off than white schools, but this isn't some result of racism on the part of white people, which is not to say that it's not unfair to black students of high student quality. In a sense it is, but it is not unfair in a way that is caused by white people, which is the sort of narrative that liberals tend to put forward. So to sum up what we've seen so far, in high schools there's a pro-black bias in terms of overall spending, class size, and teacher quality. There may be a slight pro-white bias in terms of classes offered, but there's no evidence showing that this is actually true. It's just not provably false. And even if there was evidence showing that that's true, there's not evidence showing that this matters for income. And so on net, it seems that there's a pro-black bias in American high schools. If we turn to universities, the situation is much simpler to assess because it's just so obvious, right? So once qualifications are controlled for, black students are about 20 times more likely than white students to be accepted into a law school, into a medical school, into an undergrad admission system. Hispanics are about 3 times as likely. With respect to Asian Americans, they are either 0.94 times as likely to be accepted if you use the median result of this analysis, or 1.59 times more likely if you use the average. So that's a bit hard to assess, but it doesn't seem like there's much bias going on with respect to Asian Americans. That might be a surprise to some people because of the fact that Asian Americans are suing Harvard over discrimination, but that is just one school. It may not be representative of elite institutions in America in general. In fact, it seems not to be. Now, research from Georgetown has recently shown that if selective colleges admitted students on the basis of test scores alone, as opposed to test scores plus factors like race, the proportion of students in such selective colleges that are white would increase from 66% to 75%, while the proportion of students who were Hispanic, Black, and Asian would decrease, suggesting once again that contrary to the impression of some people, there is not systemic bias against Asian Americans. Now, once you get to college, of course, you have to pay for it, and there's bias in favor of non-white students with respect to the payment of college. It's not a huge bias, but minority students account for 38% of the student population and 40.4% of grant funding. White students account for 61.8% of the student population and 59.3% of grant funding. And once again, it's just worth noting in passing that there is a grant bias in favor of Asian Americans, just to counteract the narrative that is being put forward recently that Asian students are systematically discriminated against by the universities. Now, of course, grants are not the only way you pay for college. If you look at employment during college, what we see is that there is a slight difference such that white students are more likely than black students to be employed while in college. And this may be surprising since black students are poorer than white students, but these are the facts. Asian students, by contrast, are a little less likely than white students and a little less likely than black students to be employed while in school. Of course, even if you have a job, it may be that your college is being paid for by your parents, and there is not really a racial difference here. 49% of white students and 49% of black students say that their parents did not pay for any of their college. If you ask them about whether or not their parents paid for it a little, or about half, or the majority of their college, it's pretty similar. Again, 7% of both groups say that their parents paid for the majority of their college. Hispanics are a little more likely to say that parents didn't pay for any of their college, but they're also a little more likely to say that their parents paid for the majority of their college. The group that really stands out here, in fact, is Asian Americans. As we saw before, Asian Americans are more likely than white students to get grants, but they're also more likely than white students to have their parents pay for college. And so if high school has a slight anti-white bias, the university system has a much stronger anti-white bias. But at both levels of education, there is not really a case for this idea that black poverty is explained by differences in educational opportunity. Actually, what liberals never want to do is to compare racial groups that are equated for the traits that lead to success in school performance, and then look at educational attainment after controlling for those variables. Take IQ, just the single variable IQ alone, which is not the only relevant racial difference. But if you control for scores on IQ and you look at the educational attainment of white, black, and Hispanic people who have IQ scores as high as the average college graduate, what you see is that black students have much higher educational attainment than do Hispanic and white students, the latter two having similar levels of educational attainment, at least in the early 90s when this data was recorded. And so this fact about IQ, I think, just reinforces the result of the analysis at the university and the high school level, which is that as a whole, the educational system in the United States does exhibit a racial difference in educational opportunity, and that difference particularly favors black students and particularly disfavors white students. And so if the races were actually equated for educational opportunity, the result that we would predict should be an increase in racial differences in earnings, not a decrease. So that's the video. Consider giving it a like and subscribing if you enjoyed it. Consider supporting the channel on Patreon or Subscribestar if you like the channel a lot. And either way, thanks for watching and have a good day.